Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. It's time for something a little bit different today. Let's have some fun. Let's speculate on things that we think are reasonably likely to get nerfed in patch 3.25. I wanted to look both at build options, but also something that I think doesn't get talked about enough, and that is Atlas options. So without further ado, let's get into the things that I think are likely to be nerfed in patch 3.25. Let's start with something that's not on this list. I thought long and hard about this, and I decided not to put the Adorned on it. The Adorned is an extremely meta-defining jewel among top-end players, but it is simply less meta-warping than Mage Blood, it's less accessible than Mage Blood, and so if one of those two things was deemed to be overpowered and need a nerf, it would be Mage Blood, not the Adorned. And on top of that, it's something that is encouraging people to run content that would otherwise go unrun. So the Adorned is a strong incentive to run Ahuatotli the Blind in the Delve Mines, it's a strong incentive to run Uberatsuri, it's a strong incentive to run the Vaal Omnitect, and it's also a strong incentive to run Vaal Temple. For that reason, even though there are compelling arguments to make that the Adorned is overpowered, I've not decided to put it in this video. I don't think it needs a nerf quite yet. I don't think it's quite that oppressive. But I certainly wouldn't be shocked to be proven wrong and find out that this ends up being 50 to 149% or something along those sorts of lines happens to it. We're going to start looking at the Atlas. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with PoE.ninja, this is a website that aggregates information from the Trade League and also from other leagues like Hardcore Solo Self-Found and the like, and puts it up in a data visualized setup. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. We're looking at the builds tab, and once you're there, it'll show you information on 96,249 at the time I'm recording this, characters that have a level of 90 or higher, and that have a public profile. This is not necessarily every character that's 90 plus and has a public profile, it's only the ones that have come to the website's notice, either by signing up, or by being active in trade, or by having been in the top 15,000 characters by XP at some point during the league. Anyways, it's the best aggregate that we've got, and I think it's got a lot of useful information about what high-end players are doing in PathOfExile. This here is the Atlas heat map. This is a tool that lets you visualize which nodes are the most frequently taken on the Atlas, and which are the least. Essentially, the more bright that the color is, as we approach red on the spectrum, the more frequently that particular node is taken on the Atlas, and the closer that we get to blue, i.e. the darker, the less frequently that node is taken. Let's start with the two nodes that are taken the most. These are Remarkable Relics and Skittering Swarms. These are the two most frequently taken clusters on the Atlas. Both of them, in my opinion, serve as a complete point tax on your Atlas. These are so good that they feel almost mandatory. It's not like you can't cut them from an Atlas, but cutting them off feels really bad. It feels like you're sabotaging your loot in every single map that you run if you remove these from your Atlas. And they don't do anything really exciting. They don't give you any agency over the loot you get. They just simply give you more and better. Remarkable Relics biases you against getting the more common Scarabs and towards the better Scarabs, and it's such a strong effect that it feels like it's just mandatory. And Skittering Swarms is just so efficient that people feel compelled to take it. I'd much rather that these effects become weakened to the point that they're points of last resort. They're something that you invest in if you can't see anything clear that you want to do with your tree, but they're just points that you'll put in because, yeah, I may as well spend them somewhere, and this is better than throwing 3 points into a mechanic that I can only put 3 points into. I'd rather that than what we've currently got. The other thing, though, that I think is worth pointing out is there are 9 other nodes on the tree, such as Harrowing Carapaces, Devoted Carapaces, Trapping Carapaces, and the like, that are dedicated to agency over which Scarabs you get. These, in my opinion, are completely underpowered at the moment, and I would think it would be much more interesting if these had their numbers doubled, and the other two that I pointed out before had their numbers halved, which, for purposes of Remarkable Relics, just simply means the bias towards uncommon Scarabs being 50% weaker than it is now. Specking one of these Carapaces nodes would then feel like it's giving you considerable agency rather than only a small amount of agency. The second thing, though, and I think the more important one for grinding your games to look at, is all of the various sources of a very dangerous stat that you can stack on the Atlas at the moment. And this is increased effect of modifiers on your maps. Chisel Perfection is one source of this, mounting modifiers is another, there's a bunch of small nodes that give you this stat, and then the most egregious of them all is Back to Basics. What these do is they provide a substantial boost to loot and also a substantial boost to danger, but that boost to danger is not something that you necessarily notice immediately after you spec into one of these. I want to contrast this for a second to Dance of Destruction, which is a node almost no one takes. Monsters in your map deal 25% more damage and have 25% less life. So this is something that makes maps quicker to complete and much more dangerous than they'd otherwise be, and basically no one takes it because the risk-reward balance isn't there. But one thing that's important with Dance of Destruction is if you allocate this, and then you go into the next map, you feel it immediately. The very next map that you go into, Dance of Destruction is going to kick you around if you're going to be kicked around at all by it. That, however, is not the case at all with things like Chisel Perfection. Let's say that you allocate Chisel Perfection, Back to Basics, the whole shebang, and then the next map that you go into, Back to Basics rolls low, and additionally, the map mods include players are subjected to Temporal Chains Curse. So, Temporal Chains Curse kicks in, it does nothing more than it normally does. Then there's another map mod present, and that's the one that nerfs player armor and block chance, but you're not playing a character that uses armor or block, so the map feels completely normal. So the map has two mods that aren't scaled up by all of this massive scaling of increased effective modifiers that you've scaled. So let's say that you run 2 or 3 maps like that, you're feeling like your new Atlas is working for you. Then the next map that you go into, you roll of Miring. Monsters have 50% increased accuracy rating, players have minus 20% to the amount of suppressed spell damage prevented. But this is multiplied by 230% because of all of the scaling of map mod effects that you've got. So suddenly monsters have 115% increased accuracy rating, which is like turning Grace off on your character and probably a bit more, and players have minus 46% to the amount of suppressed spell damage prevented, i.e. your suppression pretty much doesn't work. Did I mention that that's just one map mod? Then perhaps you have Fleet as well, and it's scaled up to give 62% increased monster movement speed and 71% increased monster attack speed. Suddenly, you start getting hit a lot more, and when that's by spells, you're failing to suppress it. And then on top of that, you've got 232% of physical damage dealt by monsters added as additional cold damage. All of this because of that decision that you made several maps ago to change your Atlas over to a Chisel Perfection, mounting modifiers, and Back to Basics Atlas. The fact that there is a delay between all the deaths that this causes and the decision to spec your Atlas is the real problem here, and it's something Grinding Gear games have experienced in the past, back in 3.18 when Wrath of the Cosmos was way more lethal than it is now. It was also way more lucrative than it is now, but it was way more lethal. Back then, Wrath of the Cosmos had the text, players take 25% increased damage for each Eldritch Altar that has been tapped in the area. So, if you're running a map and you only get one altar in it, doesn't really do very much. Then you run one and you tap 7 altars, and you start taking 175% increased damage, which is fairly lethal. All in all, this is a mechanic that I can definitely see being nerfed in patch 3.25. Okay, so let's talk about character builds instead. Let's have a look at some of the top performing builds of the first 2 weeks of patch 3.24 and ask, are they likely to dodge the nerf bat or not? Let's start with Cast on Critical Strike, Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, Inquisitor. Also something that's affectionately known by players as Cock DD, because calling it Cast on Critical Strike, Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, Inquisitor is definitely a mouthful and a half. This is a build that I've seen a lot of people speculating will suffer nerfs. Now, a lot of people are pointing out that Lancing Steel of Spraying, which is the delivery mechanism for the Cast on Critical Strike payload in this case, is the thing that they think is likely to get nerfed. I hope those people are wrong. I really hope that it's Detonate Dead and Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction that take the nerf here. Those skills have needed a nerf for a long time, and whilst it is the case that Lancing Steel of Spraying is arguably better than Cyclone for Cast on Critical Strike delivery, I don't think that it's oppressively good, it's just reasonably good. For that reason, I'd like to see all of these Corpse Explosion skills get the nerf that they've needed for a long time, and then at the same time, leave Lancing Steel of Spraying alone for one more league. Let's see whether it's something that shines or not when people try to use it with a different payload. I feel like there's a lot of potential unexplored territory for Cast on Critical Strike payloads that are not related to Corpse skills that could be interesting to see whether they can shine or not. I'm not sure whether they'd be great, but I do think there'd be a couple of them that would be quite good. If Grinding Gear games nail this, then we'll have a meta where it's viable to trigger spells either through Mjolnir, or through Cast on Critical Strike, or through Cast when stunned, and none of these is clearly better than the others. They're all just viable options. That's what I hope they manage to pull off. Even if they get reasonably close to that, that would be good. And I think that keeping Lancing Steel of Spraying in the game is the best way in order to do that. I hope that Detonate Dead gets buried so deep that its corpse can't be dug up and exploded, but that Lancing Steel of Spraying gets one more chance to prove itself to not be degenerate in the next league. And if it's still broken in 3.25, nerf it in 3.26. The next skill I can see getting a nerf is actually to facilitate another buff, and that's Hexblast Mines. So Hexblast and Mines go together extremely well. That's because mechanically, Hexblast is one of those skills that has tremendous, unbelievably over-the-top damage, but that has a number of things that are set up in order to make it so that you don't really want to self-cast it. It has a tremendously long 1 second cast time. It also wants to consume a curse from whatever it hits. The thing with mines is that mines let you throw out a lot of Hexblast, completely bypassing this monumental 1 second cast time, but then at the same time, mines can also be used as a delivery mechanism for curse on hit, either from a ring, or from a Val implicit on gloves, or even from a couple of more scuffed options like a Dread Arc when you're leveling. So Hexblast Mines is a very solid build. The problem though, is that mines are just fundamentally very undertuned at the moment. Mines are in a terrible spot, their damage numbers are really low. The thing is that any buff to mines that doesn't address the Hexblast issue will just end up making Hexblast Mines into a boot that stomps down on build diversity across the league. What needs to be done here is a two-pronged attack, a buff to mines in general, and some sort of mechanical change or direct nerf that makes Hexblast less useful in conjunction with mine skills. There's a number of ways that this could be done. Mines could get 20% across the board more damage, but Hexblast could have 30% less damage and 30% faster casting. That would then leave Hexblast Mines in a weaker spot than it is now, but not unplayably weak, would just be weaker than it is now, but it would also mean that other mine builds get 20% more damage than they have now, which is something they sorely need because both Blast Chain Mine and High Impact Mine support are in a pretty terrible state at the moment in my opinion, except for that Hexblast interaction. The third most popular build early on was Lightning Arrow, and this is something that fell out of favour as people started to realise that Elemental Hit of the Spectrum was basically the same build but shiny and new. There's not that much difference in power between Lightning Arrow, Ice Shot and Elemental Hit of the Spectrum. Ice Shot's pretty universally considered the weakest of the three, but it's not the weakest by very much. Lightning Arrow and Ele Hit of the Spectrum are both really good. I wouldn't be shocked if this gets a nerf, but if there is a nerf, I think it would be to medium to high-end bows. Elemental damage bows are in a very strong spot at the moment, and they're much easier to roll than comparable physical damage weapons or comparable elemental damage melee weapons, and basically they perform a little bit better than other builds that do reasonably similar things. If there's a change here, that's really all I would expect, is for the tier 1 damage numbers on bows to come down a little bit. But now let's get to the fourth most popular build early in the league, and this is the one that I can see resulting in a nerf. This is the Archmage Hierophant. Now, there are two things that this build does very well. Firstly, it league starts really solidly in conjunction with Ice Nova of Frostbolts. That skill does tremendous damage, and it would not surprise me at all to see it nerf because of its extremely overpowered damage early in progression. The second thing that I wouldn't be surprised to see happen around the mana builds is some sort of nerf to their top-end scaling vectors. There's a lot of ways that this could be done, probably relates to something around Indigon, or maybe Arcane Cloak, or the interaction between the two. Whatever it is, I wouldn't be surprised to see an end to some of the multi-billion damage per second builds that have been bouncing around, and that have been absolutely terrorizing innocent monsters that are hiding away in the delve mines. Anyways, that's a few speculations for potential things that might get nerfed in patch 3.25. What out of these do you hope I'm right on? What do you hope I'm wrong on? What do you think I'm right on? And what do you think I'm wrong on? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and may the patch notes not act as a Varlorb on your planned build for 3.25.